I think it's an irony that the US first created this Taliban group and gave them weapons and whatnot, and then the US trained the Afghan army to counter the Taliban. I want to know what is the sense of this. That's a very good question. So the US did support the Taliban at one point in time. The Taliban, in its previous incarnation, was the Afghan Mujahideen, who were the freedom fighters. If you watch that movie Rambo, Sylvester Stallone, he goes into Afghanistan to aid the Mujahideen and to help them liberate their country from the USSR. So at that time, these guys were the heroes, the Afghan Mujahideen. Then they morphed into the Taliban, and the Americans were perfectly fine with that, right? Isn't it strange? The Americans were perfectly fine with that. And then what happened was 9/11 happened. So what happened was that there was this Northern Resistance fighter, Northern Alliance warlord called Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was an ethnic Tajik. He was from the Panjshir Valley. So he was resisting the Taliban. The Taliban in 2001 assassinated him with a suicide bombing. And 2 days after Ahmad Shah Massoud's assassination, you had 9/11, the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the United States, in New York. And as far as we know, to the best of our knowledge, it was all done by Osama bin Laden, who was one of the chiefs, one of the leaders of the Afghan Mujahideen that were fighting the USSR. So it was done by Osama bin Laden, who was in Afghanistan, who was under the shelter, under the protection of the Afghan Taliban. The Americans ordered the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused. They said that he is under our protection. We have a code of ethics and honor. We will not give up a person who is our guest and who is under our shelter. In response, the Americans invaded and occupied Afghanistan. They defeated the Taliban, supposedly. What happened was that the Taliban moved again into Pakistan, into the tribal areas of Pakistan, and they sat there and waited out the time. So they were basically biding their time for a very long time, for more than a decade. Many of them were killed, many of them were destroyed, but the leadership, etc., and many of the fighters, they crossed back into Pakistan. And as you know, the Americans were doing drone strikes and all that over there, and that's led to the creation of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. So the Americans first did support the Taliban. They supported the Afghan Mujahideen, then the Taliban. They knew what was happening in Kashmir. They knew that the Pakistanis were routing all these terrorists into Kashmir to destabilize India and to make India bleed. The Americans knew what was happening. And when India complained about this, they said that this is your internal law and order problem. You are unable to take care of law and order. It is not terrorism, it is law and order. That's what the Americans would keep repeating. So they knew what was happening, and they supported it. The reason for this is very simple. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the US was still in its post-Cold War high. They had won the Cold War. They had ensured the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and they were the only remaining superpower in the world. And India had dared to declare itself a nuclear power in 1998, I think. India did 5 nuclear tests and it declared itself a nuclear power. That was unacceptable to the US. How dare this little country try and rise up to our level? And that's why the Americans allowed and encouraged the Pakistanis to conduct these terrorist operations in India, in Kashmir and other places. And that is why they allowed the formation of the Taliban, and they basically turned a blind eye towards that, or a benevolent eye towards the activities of Pakistan. Pakistan was a US ally. Pakistan was a US puppet, so to say. It was an instrument of the US, and they wanted to teach India a lesson. And that's why they encouraged the Pakistani activities of creating these terrorist outfits, a number of terrorist outfits in Kashmir, and the Taliban itself, which took over Afghanistan. So the US was fine with that. But after 9/11 happened, they had to placate their domestic population, the US public, and that's why they had to they had to punish the guys who did this terrorist attack. So that's why they invaded Afghanistan and occupied Afghanistan. And then the Taliban were the bad guys because they refused to hand over Osama bin Laden. So with the help of Pakistan, by using Pakistan as a staging base, they invaded Afghanistan. Isn't that interesting? And the Pakistanis, well, what could they do about it? The Americans were the biggest guy in the room. You cannot say no to the US. So the Pakistanis made the best of a bad situation. They helped the US, and they gained a lot from that in the form of bribes, money, military equipment, and all that. So it benefited Pakistan. But they kept the Taliban alive in Pakistan's tribal areas, and the Americans also knew this. So it is strange, it is ironic, but it is not strange and ironic. It all makes sense if you look at it from the perspective of America's interests. America's interest initially was to get rid of the USSR. It was to prop up Pakistan as a bulwark against India. It was to punish India for becoming a nuclear weapons power. It was to put India in its place, keep it down by bleeding it via Pakistan. But then, when all of this happened, when the 9/11 terrorist attacks happened, then they had to punish the Taliban. So they went into Afghanistan, occupied it, defeated, so to say, the Taliban, but kept the Taliban alive in Pakistan so as to keep the Pakistani generals on their side. And then, over time, as things evolved, as we saw the emergence of China as a serious competitor to the US, as a contender for the superpower position, that's when the Americans slowly started turning towards India. They realized that the only power in Asia that can offset China, that can counterbalance China, is India. And that's why slowly, Pakistan became less and less important for the Americans. India became more important, and that's why their policies changed. And that's what we have been witnessing over the past decade or so. So the Americans propped up the Afghan army, they propped up an Afghan government, they held elections in Afghanistan, they armed the Afghan army to fight the Taliban, but they also kept the Taliban alive. So that is the extremely complicated mess that is Afghanistan. But it makes sense if you look at it from the prism of geopolitics and from the prism of America's interests. The main actor in this entire mess is the United States of America. The secondary actor is Pakistan. India is an observer, and thus far other nations have been observers, but now things are changing fast.